Morning, friends. It's great to be with you this morning as we begin a new teaching series that we're titling Unsettled. 3 teachings from Jesus for a more anchored and fulfilling life in God. And what we're going to be doing with this teaching series, we're going to look specifically and only in Matthew 25. Then in Matthew 25, which is called Jesus' Judgment Discourse, there are 3 separate parables that he gives. The first, and we'll look at one each week, because I think just with everything that's going on, we all know that we had an election this week, and we know we've had a pandemic this year, and we're all just a little bit on edge and uneasy. And we'll find that in Matthew 25, in each of these stories, they're going to be Jesus is going to talk about 2 kinds of people, 2 groups of people. Now, life isn't always that simplistic, but it will help us take a look at those folks that are in these parables that are close to Jesus, that we can find that there are some things that we can take and put into our own lives. Now, fair warning, these are indeed Jesus' judgment discourse. So he is speaking about a judgment day that is coming. And not all of these texts that we'll hit over the next 3 weeks are really easy, and they're hard, and we got to dig into them a little bit. But I know that we're all ready to do the work. And the first one comes at us from Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13. And it reads like this. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 young bridesmaids who took their lamps and went to meet the groom. Now 5 of them were wise, and the other 5 were foolish. The foolish ones took their lamps, but didn't bring oil for them. But the wise ones took their lamps and also brought containers of oil. When the groom was late in coming, they all became drowsy and went to sleep. But at midnight there was a cry, "Look, the groom, come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and prepared their lamps. But the foolish bridesmaids said to the wise ones, "Give us some of your oil, because our lamps have gone out." But the wise bridesmaids said, "No, because if we share with you, there won't be enough for our lamps and yours. We have a better idea. You go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were gone to buy oil, the groom came. Those who were ready went with him into the wedding. The door was shut. Later, the other bridesmaids came and said, "Lord, Lord, open the door for us." But he replied, "I tell you the truth, I don't know you. Therefore, keep alert, because you don't know the day or the hour." I mentioned to you that in Matthew 25, we're going to be looking at all 3 of these stories that come up in Jesus' judgment discourse. And these are the last teachings in the Gospel of Matthew before Jesus is anointed and at Bethany, before he is betrayed to go and be crucified. And so these are Jesus' kind of final parting words before we move into the Passion narrative in Matthew. So they're extremely important. And over the next 3 weeks, we hope and we'll look at each of these teachings to discuss and discover what I hope you get 3 things out of this. Is how can you personally lead a more fulfilling life in this world? Where can we find and eliminate fear and anxiety in our lives? And how can we become more anchored to God today? Finding those places where we can draw near and draw closer and stay more anchored in this life, so that no matter what happens on the outside, whether who's elected or whatever happens, that we can still kind of remain anchored in this life regardless of the storms. Because through Matthew 25, or Jesus' final teachings in the Gospel of Matthew, they parallel and begin all the way back in Matthew chapter 5 with something that you may know as the Sermon on the Mount. Where in 25, we're going to get 3 judgment stories about what's going to happen at the end, about being ready, about serving the poor and the hungry, and doing the most with what God has given us in this world. Chapter 5 begins, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Let your light shine before all people, and then no one who has a lamp hides it underneath a bushel. You are a city on a hill." Remember these? Jesus is going to lay out loving your enemies. He lays out this kingdom ethic of how we're supposed to live in this life in Matthew 5, and ends with whoever hears these words and does them is like someone who builds their house on a rock. Now in 25, as we see, we start to get this future sense of the kingdom of God. Where Matthew 5 talks about the present tense, the things that are kind of going on around us. Jesus very rarely speaks of the kingdom of God in the future tense, only 4 times in Matthew. And at the beginning of Matthew 25, the story we just heard read, that begins in the future tense. So 5 kind of deals in the present. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And in Matthew 25, we're going to get the future tense of these verbs, something that's coming later. And a good way to think about this is when I was in Afghanistan, both times, the dismounted, we call it dismounted improvised explosive devices were kind of everywhere, which is scary. Scary because anytime that our convoy stopped or you were conducting a patrol, you always had to be vigilant. You always had to make sure of what was happening around you, and you always had to look to make sure that there weren't dangers for either you or your brothers and sisters on your right and your left. And so we always had this campaign. It happened all the time. We called it our 5s and 25s, which simply meant every time a convoy stopped, you were to get out of your truck or stop, and you would clear the first 5 meters of what's directly in front of you, making sure there's no mines or explosive devices kind of around you, kind of moved earth, but you got to pay really close attention. So you kind of clear out about 5 meters or 15 feet right out in front of you, and then we do 25 meters. So as your section kind of can get out of its vehicle and do the first 5 meters, and then you would deliberately start to clear that next 25 meters in order to avoid from anybody in that convoy getting hurt. Well, one thing I always like to say about our Gospels is that I always hoped that me, myself, and that for you, that we were 5 and 25 kind of Christians. Now, let me explain that. 5 and 25 in the sense of Matthew chapter 5, where we get Jesus, the greatest sermon of all time, the kingdom ethic as laid out by none other than Jesus himself, Matthew chapter 5. And that kind of gives us that first 5 meters. It tells us how to relate with one another in this world. It talks a lot about relating with God in prayer, but mainly deals with our relationships right here, directly around us. He's going to go into teachings on divorce and teachings on loving our enemies. Those direct things that impact us right in our everyday lives, those 5-meter targets. And then Matthew 25, that we're going to get that future tense of what our lives are to be like within the kingdom and God's kind of dream for this world and the coming judgment. And so we kind of get that futures, and we can't kind of live in one or the other too much. And so I always said that we want to be 5 and 25 kinds of Christians. And that we can't necessarily deal with what is to come until we deal with what's right around us and the dangers that kind of come up around us and how we live with one another and how we connect with God. We also can't jump out and do the 25 too much and forget all of the people that are around us that make this life so beautiful and make it is what God made it to be. Where Matthew 25 looks at those relationships around us, Matthew 25 anticipates our futures with God. And really, friends, like we said, there's really no sense in looking ahead if we don't do what's right directly in front of us. So I challenge you, as we begin to look at these texts, are you a Matthew 5 and 25 kind of Christian? And I just hope that we were a Matthew 5 and 25 kind of church. But in the first of these teachings in Matthew 25, we see that we'll be looking at over the next 3 weeks. Jesus tells this parable that kind of fuses this concept together. And it's the one I just read to you about 10 bridesmaids, and it tells you right at the beginning that 5 were foolish and 5 were wise. In that the ones that were wise they all were going to meet the bridegroom, and they were going there, and the ones that were wise took an extra flask of oil with them, and while the foolish ones just kind of grabbed their torches and their lamps and they went. Now, early in first century Palestine, it would be often, if a wedding was to be held at night, torches would light the street for the bridegroom to come to where he was going to go. And when it was announced, those torches wouldn't last very long, or those lamps wouldn't last very long, so they'd be lit when the ones up ahead were lit, or they would be notified to light those so that the bridegroom could find his way to the feast. Now, to be sure, there's a lot of metaphor in this story. In that, back in Matthew 5, when we get that kingdom ethic kind of laid out to us, Jesus ends it with, those who hear these words and do them are like someone who builds their house on a rock. And kind of gives us that comparison to someone who builds his house on sand. Like that common hymn goes, all other grounds are sinking sand, all other grounds are sinking sand. In that, laying out this metaphor that you have two houses with two different kinds of foundations. The metaphor kind of lays out two houses that look the same on the outside. They look to be of the same construct, but what they were built on made all of the difference. In the same way, at the beginning of Matthew 25, he's going to lay out this parable to us with a set of 10 bridesmaids, one group. Most scholars would say that that meant that this was insider language having to deal with the church itself. Jesus was now talking to those followers, in other words, those closest to him, those in the church, Christians, if you will. Where it seems on the appearance that the bridesmaids are all the same, only some took their flasks and some didn't. Now, it would have been really odd, even in first century Palestine, for the bridegroom, as it says, to show up at midnight. So there would have been no reason for even the foolish bridesmaid to think that they would have needed the flask. And when I reflect on this text this week, I looked at it and saw that the wise ones, it was just simply part of their life. And while we can take apart and find that metaphor for the bridesmaids as being Christians or followers of Christ, the oil and the lamps is a little harder to tease out. And that the only other time that oil and lamps kind of comes up in our ancient Hebrew text, it has something to do with the Torah and wisdom. Oftentimes in the Old Testament, the book of Numbers, oil and lamps have something to do with our works and good deeds that we do. But perhaps it's something a little closer back, if we look back in Matthew 5, we find that lighting our lamps with the oil are like those who are a city on a hill, who light their lamps, and that oil is representative of good works. And that is to say, when we take that and put it into this parable, it's just that those works and those unfoolish bridesmaids, the wise bridesmaids, it was just a part of who they were. It wasn't that they knew that the other ones didn't have oil or the other ones weren't necessarily thinking in that way. It was just part of who they were. They were going to carry extra oil as a result of who it is that they were going to meet. And then we find out that later that these bridesmaids all then fall asleep. Now, it would be easy to look at this portion of the text and say, well, aren't they all unwise? And this kind of brings up and conjures up images of the disciples falling asleep at Gethsemane. But the truth is, it seems that in the text that's not really the point of Jesus telling the story here. All, even the wise, fall asleep while waiting for the bridegroom. When I look at that this time, I think the thought that hit me when I read this text this week was that any night in any subsequent generation, one after another, can seem dark. We are all prone to fall asleep while waiting. But the preparation came before that happened. Again, I think those flasks that were taken by those wise bridesmaids were there because it was just a part of who they were. We later find out that these bridesmaids then, when the announcement comes that the bridegroom is on his way, they begin to light their torches. And here's where we really start to neck down on this sermon series, Unsettled, in that we start to see that right here at this moment in this parable, the two groups finally kind of show their colors. That up until this point, the bridesmaids would have all looked the same. They all looked the same. They all probably had on the same dresses that the bride picked out for them, and I'm sure they were lovely. But at this point, they probably all looked the same until the bridegroom came, and then the differences began to be seen. Some of them, because of who they were and who it was that they knew that they were going to meet, all had the same task of just going to meet the bridegroom. Only one seemed to be prepared for the task, and the others now become very anxious. Have you ever shown up to something completely unprepared? Show of hands. You know what that feels like. Imagine that moment when they find out that the bridegroom is coming and the anxiousness of which they are going to feel to look and find out that the other 5 people, their friends who had been there the whole time, they had flasks. And of course, what do they immediately do? They just ask, can't you give us some? Now, this is the part of the story. As long as I've known and I've read this story since I was a kid, I've always had a problem with it. Why couldn't they share? They don't share. When I look at the text now, certainly they say, well, there's not enough of the oil for us and you, so you go buy some. I immediately read this and think, dang God, there had to have been enough for both of you, right? I think of it in the same way of watching the ending scenes of the movie Titanic when you're seeing Jack and Rose there on the door. There's certainly enough room on the door. Isn't there enough oil then for everyone? The wise bridesmaids make it quite clear there's not enough to go around in this case. They tell them, even at midnight, to go and find oil someplace else. And it doesn't seem the point of the story for them to send them off on some kind of wild goose chase. I think we're to take this at face value and simply believe that it would have been an option for them to go find the oil, and so they leave. Friends, if mistake number one in this story was not coming prepared to the wedding feast, not coming ready, the second was missing sight of the final goal. I'm going to read you this verse right here. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 young bridesmaids who took their lamps and went out to meet the groom. The task was simple. Go out and meet the groom. Although it says 5 of them picked their lamps and oil with them, and some of them only took their lamps, when we get to the point and they're getting to have this decision, the foolish bridesmaids are having to decide between missing the goal of just meeting the bridegroom and running out in their anxiousness to go and get the oil at the request of those wise bridesmaids. Friends, have you ever made, I just want to throw this out there, and I doubt anybody has ever done this before. Have you ever made just a completely irrational decision based off your own fear and anxiety about what is coming? Oftentimes it is when I am ill prepared to handle the situation that I'm currently going in. I know this may not have happened to anyone there, but friends, it is terrifying. And then even to think that somehow I'm going to fix my own unpreparedness by rushing around and making more quick decisions, and maybe then I can fix this myself, right? They miss sight of the final goal. Now, we'll never know. I also wondered what would have happened if they just would have stopped to think. What truly would have happened if the bridegroom come and their lamps just simply would not have been lit? We'll never know. But it does seem the point of the story that those bridesmaids showed up unprepared. And if we're to take the metaphor as what the Scripture seems to show it, and that these are good works, and our lives lived out in love in this world according to the ethic that Jesus has laid out, they showed up to the feast not ready. They showed up to the feast knowing Jesus here, but without taking the time to get him here. Reverend Fred Craddock says that the journey from the head to heart is often the longest. And in hurry and in their anxiety, they rush out, and of course they miss the groom. They come back to the door, and they knock on the door and say, "Lord, Lord, let us in." And he comes out and says, I don't even know you. A reference back to Matthew 7. When, again, the kingdom of heaven seems to be cut off for some, and those on the outside yell up at Jesus, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not do good works? Did we not do everything? Did we not do these things in your name?" And Jesus says, "I don't even know you." Harsh words from anybody, cutting words from the lips of Jesus himself. But here we are. Perhaps the foolishness, it wasn't even just in being unprepared, at least in both of these situations. In Matthew chapter 7, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, and at the end of this story, in Matthew 25, we find 2 separate groups trying to do everything they can in this life to control their inability to prepare for the situation. They didn't need the bridegroom at that case. And before, all that group turning and looking to Jesus about prophesying in his name, they're talking about everything that they did instead of looking at Jesus and everything that Jesus has done for them. Oftentimes, I don't even think we stop to take stock in all of that. I know many have said that this year was just a really long year for them, whether it was the news cycle, whether it was the pandemic, or whether it's now these closing days and a razor-thin election, that it was just a long year. For me, it went by so fast. So fast because it seemed so busy and so anxious to get one thing done to another. And in the midst of all of that busyness, you don't often stop to think about the one that has given you the strength to do anything. To take stock and simply think, am I reaching the ultimate goal? Was the goal to meet the bridegroom? Or were we just running around trying to solve everything ourselves in order to make everything just seem a little bit more normal? And I get it. And friends, it is hard, difficult to make these texts palatable to a 21st century audience. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it. These are the judgment texts before Jesus goes to the very cross himself. He wanted us to get this message. Show up prepared. Be ready in this life to know me. Don't lose sight of the goal. And don't rush out in anxiousness and fear. Because when it came down to it, when they realized that they were unprepared, I think those bridesmaids forgot who it was coming down the road. I think if they would have had that relationship, that constant, if that journey from head to heart really would have made it, I think they would have known, of course the bridegroom's going to be late. He has been known to stop and heal a few people along the way. He has been known to stop and take time to talk to sinners. He has been known to stop by and even talk to those folks who are tax collectors. He's been known to take time out for children. But he wouldn't understand. I'm running low. I don't have any oil to give. I gotta go. I gotta rush out. Friends, I think they lost sight of who it was they were waiting for. Friends, may we, in the midst of this busy season, in the midst of yet another tumultuous election cycle, the one thing we can do to not let this toss us about and let us not lose sight of what the goal is. Are we Matthew 5 and 25 kinds of Christians? Are we taking care of business with those directly around us in our 5-meter circles, in our Matthew 5 circles? Are we looking ahead to the goal, to the kingdom of heaven, and putting it into our present work? Not running around in our anxiousness about who it is that we're going to meet. I think they just forgot. Friends, if I did nothing for you today, maybe it is just a reminder that the one and the bridegroom that comes down the road lit by the torches of people's love and good works in this world. Yeah, he's probably going to be delayed, because he's been known to stop by and talk to people and heal people like you and me. May it be so, friends. God bless and have a great week.